It's a great pleasure for me as Dean of the Law School to welcome you today to the Law School for what we expect will be a path-breaking and provocative conference on a significant issue, the comparative status of men and women, boys and girls in the United States and more globally, or to use our keynote speaker Hanna Rosin's coinage, the end of men and the rise of women. I will try not to appear too gleeful. You might ask, that was a joke, okay. You might ask why a law school would devote a conference to evaluate a thesis made by a journalist. The answer is that Hanna Rosin's article, The End of Men, published in the Atlantic Monthly 2 years ago and expanded in her recent book, raises serious questions about equality and inequality, advantage and disadvantage with respect to basic institutions like the family, the workplace, the economy, schools, colleges, and universities, as well as about the role of government, a timely issue in this election season. The BU Law School community and the legal profession more generally have a deep interest in such issues. And I can't help but put a little plug in here about BU Law's own pioneering role in admitting women. So we can boast, of course, the first woman admitted to the bar in the Commonwealth, the first woman who also happened to be African-American editor-in-chief of a law review, the first woman Attorney General of the Commonwealth, the first woman judge on the First Circuit, as well as the first Chief Judge, the same person, the first African-American woman on the First Circuit, and of course Barbara Jordan, who has too many firsts to list. Hanna Rosin's thesis about the evident decline of men and ascent of women in these various domains of society that I alluded to before raises concerns for lawyers as well as for the general public. And I'm confident that the papers presented by a truly impressive roster of speakers and the rich discussions that you will have over the next 2 days will move us forward in understanding and addressing those issues. The advantage of research universities like BU is that they provide a welcoming forum in which to push beyond the sound bites and the media buzz of the moment to a more careful and constructive examination. Although it's certainly exciting for us at the law school to be hosting a conference that has garnered so much media attention. I want to thank the conference committee, Linda McLean, Kate Silbaugh, Kiara Bridges, and Chris Collins for its foresight in picking this timely topic many months ago. I know this took a lot of planning, and I want to thank especially our committee chair, Linda McLean, for her outstanding leadership in organizing the conference and her tireless efforts in working with her colleagues to put together really such a dynamic and first-rate program. When Linda joined our faculty several years ago, it helped to solidify our strengths that we already had in gender in the law and in family law, fields to which Kate and Chris were already making substantial contributions. Hiring their colleague and conference coordinator, co-planner Kiara Bridges moved us along even further. You can see their strength reflected in the number of BU Law faculty participating in the conference. And the inclusion of BU colleagues from other departments also shows our commitment to the one BU philosophy. And I do particularly want to thank the conference committee for making this such an interdisciplinary conference, not just across BU, but across other institutions and departments around the country. Finally, I want to thank the Boston University Law Review and its editor-in-chief, Andrew Flippo, for working with the conference committee on the conference planning. They will have a lot of work ahead, and so I want to thank also the Law Review faculty moderator, Jim Fleming. Andrew and his colleagues are excited about working with the speakers to bring the presentations that you will hear at the conference to publication in what will surely be another one of the BU Law Review's influential and widely cited symposium issue. I hope that you enjoy your time here at BU and have a chance to visit the main law school and wander around, see some of the photos of our distinguished alumni on the walls. Now I will turn the podium over to Linda McLean to introduce our keynote speaker, Hanna Rosin.
Good morning. Thank you, Dean, for your remarks, and I thank the law school for their generous support of this conference. I want to thank my co-organizers, Kate Silbaugh, Kiara Bridges, and Chris Collins, for working collaboratively with me on this project. It's been a real pleasure putting this together. I want to also thank Andrew Flippo and the Law Review for their support of this idea. And I especially want to thank Elizabeth Agate, our events coordinator, because she has really been tireless in all the hard work that it's taken to put a conference like this together. And the speakers all have had many dealings with her. So we welcome you all, and we thank you for joining us in what we believe will be a stimulating conference on a timely and significant topic. Maureen has already said a little bit about why we thought this topic warranted attention. When my co-organizers and I chose this End of Men thesis as the conference topic, it seemed to crystallize a kind of story we had noticed in recent years, that something was happening to men and boys. You've probably seen some of these magazine headlines. The Great Recession was being dubbed a he session or a man session. Major news magazines like Newsweek told men to man up and become more like women by taking up so-called girly jobs and doing more housework and child care at home, or else risk becoming extinct, adapt or become unnecessary. Stories about boys worried that schools were schools were better suited to the needs and talents of girls than boys, and that boys were left behind, the so-called boy crisis. At the same time, as gender scholars, we wanted to know more about two different types of stories being told about women. One, the feminist revolution is a triumph, and now women are even surpassing men and becoming the dominant sex. Or two, the gender revolution is stalled. Some stories even linked the evident triumph of feminism to the decline of men. Kay Heimowitz, a prominent conservative thinker, wrote a book, Man Up, How the Rise of Women Has Turned Men into Boys. So in this climate, Hanna Rosin's 2010 article in The Atlantic, The End of Men, introduced a term into this discussion and put something out there that made people uncomfortable. It seemed to strike a nerve. Why? As scholars keenly interested in issues of gender equality and struggles over gender roles in family and marriage, we were intrigued by arguments about indicators of men's decline being paired with arguments about women's rise. Is it possible, we ask, to admit that women have made some progress, and how might that shape diagnoses of sex equality? What was it about Rosin's article, we wondered, that gave it such legs? And since we invited her, she's managed to come out with a full-length book on this issue, showing our foresight and prescience in picking this topic. So the aim of our conference is an evaluation of the claim, a critical investigation in the hope of deepening our understanding. And the dean has explained that's one of the strengths of a research institution. And we hope to do this in a constructive and civil way. And we thank Hanna Rosin in advance for being part of this, because it can't be easy to be the recipient of so much sustained attention and criticism, constructive or otherwise. So I've read all the conference papers, and I can assure you that this presentations will be impressive and of high caliber and very, very interesting. And to spare our moderators the need to spend a lot of time telling you all the accomplishments of our speakers who come from all over the country, we have a document at the registration table with biographies of all our speakers, which gives you a sense of the range of their scholarship. So before I introduce Hanna Rosin, I'm just going to say a few words about the schedule for the day, just the mechanics quickly. Hanna Rosin's going to give a keynote address. We're going to have two commentators on her address, Professor Ralph Richard Banks and Professor Michael Kimmel, about whom I'll say more in just a few minutes. And then there'll be time for colloquy among the three of them and questions and answers. That'll conclude at 11. There'll be a brief coffee break, and then we'll start at 11:15 with our first panel on historical perspectives. Following that, we're so delighted that Joan Williams, a preeminent expert on work life and work family issues, will be giving a luncheon talk up in 1270 in the main law building. There's elevators that will take you up there. It may take a while, but you will get there. And then we'll be back in the afternoon for two terrific panels on two of the domains that Hanna Rosin talks about in her book: employment, the workplace, and family. And I have some wonderful people participating in those things. Now, one of the things you'll notice after we finish this first session is that our local university bookstore, Barnes & Noble, will be setting up a display table. And they have books available for sale. And in addition to Hanna Rosin's book, The End of Men and the Rise of Women, they will have books by many of our conference speakers. And so I encourage you to browse and see some of the things that our really impressive group of speakers have written. And at the end of the day today, in Barristers Hall, which is in the main building on the ground floor, there will be a reception, and the bookseller will stay through the end of the reception. You'll have another chance to buy books, to get someone to sign a book, Hanna Rosin, the other scholars that are here, et cetera. Okay, so that's enough of the mechanics. So I've already said that it wasn't a hard pick to settle on Hanna Rosin as the keynote speaker, and we are so delighted that she has accepted this invitation. I know it's got to be challenging for a journalist to come into an academic setting, but we're so happy that she was willing to do that. And there's a bio of Hanna Rosin in your materials, but let me just briefly say that she's a senior editor at The Atlantic, which is where she first reported on the end of men. She's also a founder of Double X, Slate's women's section, and has written for numerous magazines and newspapers. She headlined the first TED Women's Conference and has appeared on many television shows. And she wrote a prior book, God's Harvard, a Christian college on a mission to save America. So I'm going to introduce her in just a minute. And I would say just a word about our commentators. We were so thrilled to have two prominent scholars come and comment on Rosin's address. Our first is Ralph Richard Banks of Stanford Law School. He himself is familiar with being at the center of media attention for a provocative book, because recently he wrote Is Marriage for White People, which got a lot of attention and will be on the display table out front a little bit later. And because one of Rosin's themes is a class divide concerning marriage, we wanted Rick to offer his views, given his extensive look at patterns of marriage and how they break down based on race. And when the topic is what's happening to men, manhood, or masculinity, the name that immediately comes to mind to many of us is Michael Kimmel, our second commentator. He's a professor of sociology at SUNY Stony Brook, and as you will see from the book table, Professor Kimmel has published numerous books on manhood in America, changing ideas of masculinity, and in Rosin's book, she discusses his book, Guyland. Kimmel is also no stranger to the spotlight and has frequently been interviewed in the media. In fact, just this morning, before coming here, he and Hanna Rosin were out at NECN for a television show on this very topic. So without further delay then, I'm delighted to present to you our keynote speaker, Hanna Rosin.
Thank you, Linda. I noticed that you almost called me professor at some point by mistake. As Linda alluded, this is an unusual and I must admit somewhat uncomfortable position for me, because I'm a journalist, as you all know, and I'm vastly more used to being at the other end of this podium, listening to academics give talks. And I have to say that most of the people invited to this conference are people whose work I have read for a long time and greatly admired and heavily leaned on. So that makes it even more strange for me to be up here. The idea that so many of you have written direct responses to my book is something that I should perhaps find flattering, but actually find quite terrifying. But I will say that the benefits to me have been tremendous. I have learned a whole lot from all of you deepening certain elements of this and refining my thinking on a lot of these questions, and in fact have changed greatly the way I talk about the book, because books are imperfect, and as you have them out there and have people responding to them, I certainly have learned a huge amount about many of these topics. So that's just a note of gratitude to all of you who have taken the time to think about it and respond to it. I want to start in a very minute place. This is actually this is a chapter that got left out of the book. As I was doing the research, I did a survey for Slate magazine about couples where the woman makes more money than the man, not necessarily married couples. I just wanted to, this wouldn't, I don't think, rate as sociology in a research institution, because the readers of Slate are skewed. I mean, they're much more educated and they make a lot more money than your average population. But nonetheless, I had a sociologist help me write up a survey, asking a lot of questions and gathering a lot of data. Some 8,000 people answered the survey, and then we sort of graphed the material. I just wanted to get a sense of kind of power dynamics, how these couples saw each other, how the men and women viewed each other. And then I did a couple of hundred follow-up interviews, which I'm sorry to say didn't make it in the book. We decided ultimately not to include that chapter, but I want to start with that. Here's a couple that I talked about, Andrea and Bill, let's call them, because that's their names. They were not married, actually. They were engaged. They were both working at the same firm at the time. It was a computer consulting firm, and the reason that I chose them is because they were sort of an exact, they were literally in the same job when they started out, and then she got promoted a little bit faster than he did, and at the end of a few years, she was making some $8,000 more than he was. This was a fairly typical situation, I would say. I interviewed some couples in which the wife was making vastly more money or in which the husband didn't work at all, but often in cases of people who answered my survey, the wife was making just a little bit more money than the man. Nonetheless, sometimes this would unsettle the man in the relationship. This once totally rare occurrence of a woman making more money than her husband or her boyfriend has now become a somewhat more common phenomenon, certainly not the majority, but it's an increasingly common situation among couples, especially young couples as they're starting out their lives. So you can imagine a range of reactions that Bill would have. He could be proud of his wife, he could be somewhat jealous, he could be resentful, he could be relieved, or he could feel totally emasculated. Or he could feel all of these things at once. And generally what I found in the interviews is that you'd find elements of these things happening in these couples. So I'm going to read you the testimony that Bill gave me, which is cobbled together from emails and phone interviews I did. My wife Andrea and I both started at the same IT company straight from college, and after a few years, she overtook me professionally. I sat around thinking maybe she had better opportunities or some great breaks, but the reality is she worked harder, she was more organized, and she made better use of her time. There's nothing to ascribe it to except she's better than me. The most painful moment was when we were at a party and one guy turned to us and said, "You guys are doing great. Andrea, you're a vice president, and Bill, well, we don't know what you are." I laughed along with everyone else, but 8 years later, I can still remember that moment very clearly. I was like, wow, I'm the naked emperor here. Ultimately, it's not that I wish she was less successful, it's that I wished I was less unsuccessful. It's a guy thing, it sucks to be beaten up by a woman. Maybe that sounds misogynistic, but it's hard to break that mold. Now, I will point out that Bill and Andrea described their relationship as very happy and having a low rate of divorce. This wasn't the ultimate commentary on their relationship. This was just one strain of what he felt about the situation as he was recounting it. As many of you know, and as Linda mentioned, this started out as an article in The Atlantic in 2010, and in the early days of writing this, I was actually thinking mostly about this in economic terms. I started doing the research in 2009. That's the year when women became the majority of the American workforce for that brief moment. They're more something like 50% now. That was the height of the recession when a lot more men were losing their jobs. And I just started to wonder about that. How was it that, even when I was a kid, the idea of a working woman was unusual enough that there were several sitcoms devoted to her existence, and we would think it was so cool that there was a woman in a pantsuit on TV, and how interesting was that? And then yet here I am, a grown-up, and women are the majority of the workforce. And so I just wondered, was this purely an economic question? Were they having an easier time adapting to the new economy? But as the years went on and I started researching the book, I actually began to be much more interested in how these economic changes were affecting relationships between an individual man and an individual woman, two people, marriages. Were there larger trends that you could look at on how the rise of women were affecting intimate relationships, both for young people and for older people? So that's what my book research, I think, is largely about. You can hear in Bill's testimony that he's proud of Kathy, but he also feels stung and ambivalent about the situation. And I think that's to be expected in an era where, on the one hand, fathers are, much more involved and expected to be much more involved in their children's lives. And on the other hand, you have whole swaths of society where fathers are hardly able to be involved in their children's lives at all. So I think it's a little bit confusing what it means to be a modern man. Now, what about Andrea? You can imagine her range of reactions. She too could be psyched, empowered, self-conscious, resentful. I had so many different reactions from the Andreas that I'm going to read you two different versions of Andrea. Here is resentful Andrea, which constituted, I would say, about a quarter of the women that I interviewed in the survey. Since earning my law degree in 1989, I have felt hunted like a deer by men as a desirable wife because of my wage-earning capability and good job. I'll never forget my good friend's husband announcing at their wedding reception, "Now that I've married a lawyer, I won't have to work anymore." And he didn't. That's the resentful Andrea. Now I'm going to read you delighted Andrea. I'm the one who's career-oriented. I don't want to come home to someone I have to compete with. Let's see, who can climb to the top of the career ladder? Who can make the most money? I was so sick of it. I wanted someone who didn't want to talk about their job all day, but who would rather go for a bike ride on the beach. So his making less money was kind of a plus for me. So you lawyers should appreciate those, those powerful female lawyers. So I don't give you those examples because I want to show you young men and women pitted against each other in forever a battle about who gets to be top dog. I just think that because these arrangements are fairly novel, it's quite interesting and important to plumb a little bit what they mean and how they manifest themselves. I don't actually think that this is necessarily good or bad. I think it's decidedly mixed, and I think it runs the gamut, as you can see from the couples I interview in my book, from exciting to totally heartbreaking. And I think it depends on how old you are, where you come from, and how you started your life and what your parents do. Just the other day, I got an email from someone who said, "I don't know what your problem is. This is really awesome. You're going on and on about how difficult this is. I'm a stay-at-home dad. All anyone ever does is applaud me." And then I looked at the sign-off of the email, and of course, the guy was from Portland. So I thought, well, okay, in Portland, maybe that's what they say, but it's not how it is everywhere else. So for a woman and a man, say, from Alabama, which is where I report one of my chapters, where they've been used to living life in a particular way, I think these changes are a lot more unsettling. So now that I've talked about this individual couple, I want to zoom out a little bit and imagine a single American town. Why did I choose this particular American town? I chose it for several reasons. I guess I wanted a very tight lab experiment of the waning of the manufacturing economy. So I wanted to choose a place in which a lot of the adults had been employed by a single manufacturer, and as a journalist, you're always looking. I originally actually went to Kansas City, which is where my article was reported, but because Kansas City is so big and diffuse, it's actually hard to track something so intimate as changing relationships in a place that's that big. So I'm trying to zoom in a place that was a little bit smaller, so I chose this town called Alex City, which had a textile manufacturer. Now, you will find no feminists in this town. If there are feminists in this town, they are deeply closeted. The number of times I heard the word bra burner, including from the first female mayor in the town, were many, and they were from both young women and older women. So this is not a story about the feminist revolution taking hold in Alexander City, except accidentally. This was a place where, until very recently, a man was able to have a pretty prosperous middle-class existence working as a manager in the factory. There were lots of men there who were making $70,000, $100,000 working as managers. It was also a place where, in a university town, we think of patriarchy as something that we read about or learn about in a gender studies textbook, but in a place like Alexander City, the patriarchy is extremely tangible. It literally runs the town. You have the Russell family who started the plant, and then you have their relatives, and then you have the managers of the town, and they are all head of the Lions Club and the Little League clubs and the Civic Society, and the patriarchy is visible every place that you go. About 10 years ago, I don't really need to tell you this story, Russell had the same thing happen to it that happened to any manufacturing town and can be repeated all across eastern Alabama. And so a very unusual situation happened in Russell because it was such a tight town in which so many people worked in this factory. So the women basically, a different thing happened between the men and the women. Some of the women were already working as teachers. Some of the women, this was the town I wrote about for my New York Times magazine excerpt, and actually that excerpt includes very different reporting than what's in the book. But something very different happened in that town that had happened before, which is that more women than ever before found themselves as the only providers of the steady paycheck and the health insurance in their households. And I think, this really did a number on people's understanding, especially their biblical understanding, really, of what the role of a man was and what the role of a woman was. So I went there several times, and I'm just going to quote you a little bit from one of my favorite people there, who's a man named Charles Geddes, who was a sort of high-up executive in Russell, who then lost his job. His wife turned out to be extremely successful in the medical center, because medical centers are places that thrive in small towns. What happened to Charles was, as he was looking for a job, one day he called the unemployment office, And the voice that answered the phone sounded very familiar, and it turned out that it was his old secretary there working at the unemployment office. And then she transferred him to her manager, and it turned out that she was another woman who had worked for him back at the Russell factory. And so that was a moment when a light bulb went off for Charles, and here's what he told me. You're going to laugh at this, but it was harder on the men than the women. It seemed like their skills were more, what's the word, transferable. I was born in the South where the men take care of their women. Suddenly it's us who are relying on the women. Suddenly we got the women in control. And he didn't say this, by the way, with any bitterness. He just was trying to work out in his head what had changed in his life and had turned upside down. So why do I call this a matriarchy? I realize that's a word that makes a lot of you out there who are much more careful with your words than we journalists are bristle. But here I will just explain to you here why I use the word matriarchy in relation to this situation. It seemed to me that what I was witnessing happening in Alabama was almost precisely what had happened in inner city Chicago and been described by William Julius Wilson and what Daniel Patrick Moynihan later described as an emerging matriarchy. So you had the blue-collar jobs disappearing, and as a result, the men having a hard time finding their way. Now, for the older couples, who were essentially the couples that I wrote about in the New York Times Magazine excerpt, they had been living in a certain way long enough that they were able to reconcile the new economic realities with their biblical philosophy and the sort of lodestars of their life. So I would not say that their lives were necessarily turned upside down. They were fairly genteel about it. But if you read the book chapter, for the younger generation, the picture really looks quite different. You do get the first hints, and in the book chapter, I sort of go down the generations of a situation where marriage is becoming less frequent and the families feel like they're falling apart, and you have a husband and, a man and a woman who are not married but have children, and she's pregnant, and the situation looks a little more shaky. I was really delighted to read, I've been waiting a long time to read Kathy Eden's book about fathers, and so I was so delighted to have a chapter included among the conference papers where she describes, her words, not mine, the young men in this situation who get derailed because, as she put it, they do a lot of stupid shit, which is really a situation that I encountered. And a couple of her insights were things that I witnessed myself. The younger generation of these men whose ties with the mothers are not all that strong. And the most insightful thing, which I hadn't thought of but resonates with me a lot, which is the mothers become that the mothers to the men become these kind of authority figures that the men feel like they've been fighting against all their life. So here you've got this mother who's trying to boss you around, tell you what to do, get money out of you, and they have the same they treat the mother like she's the man, basically, like just another man hassling them. And I think that's something that I noticed too. Maybe I'm going to read you just a quick thing here from this chapter. This is a couple, Shannon and Troy, who are not in the New York Times piece, but appear in the book. And he describes himself as married to me when I first met them. And it took me, I think it was on my fourth visit, that he said to me, married in here, which meant to me that they weren't actually married, that just in his heart they were married. And, he had a tattoo with her name on it, but they weren't married. He hadn't worked for a long time. He had your, sort of basic profile of a guy who, the poignant thing about him is that he, as somebody else, his friend told me about him, he was waiting for the Russell factory to come back the same way some people wait for Elvis to come back. That he had a sense of the factory as almost a phantom limb that existed in this town that would somehow sort of rescue him, even though it was perfectly clear. And at the end of the chapter, she takes him to the factory just kind of like to throw it in his face that it's completely rusted out and it's never coming back. But he has this expression that he uses, ain't a man, and he uses it in a lot of different ways. So I'm just going to read you a quick paragraph. Troy's favorite expression is, ain't a man, which he uses in several contradictory ways. Sometimes it's a kind of boast. Ain't a man who wouldn't want my lady, even if he's gay, he'll say, and enumerate all the ways in which Shannon is smoking hot. Sometimes, though, the expression betrays his own humiliation. Ain't a man who would take that from his wife, he says, recalling the time when, for 3 nights straight, Shannon came home at 4 in the morning with no explanation. Ain't a man would do that refers to the night 3 when he waited up for Shannon to come home and then choked her until she passed out. It was my darkest hour, he says. To make it up for her, he bought her a choker with a really big silver heart to cover the bruises. So I think, that's just another mark of the great ambivalence that some people feel about this changing situation. The last thing I'm going to say about this matriarchy is I think that there is a standard criticism, which I'm quite aware of, that we define these growing number of single mother households as immediately dysfunctional and against the norm. It's possible that I talk about it that way in my book, but I actually don't feel that way. I think I'm more in the Andrew Cherlin school of the marriage go around, that the idea that in fact our American obsession with marriage has become sort of dysfunctional, and we refuse to recognize couples like Shannon and Troy or give them any help or in any way sort of support socially these couples that are thinly stitched together, which I think is something we should start doing if we're going to have an increasing number of single parent households. Okay, we've gone from the individual couple to the town. Now I want to zoom out even more and talk about what's going on in the nation and what I started to notice when I began this research. By the way, I haven't been timing myself at all, so I'm just talking and talking here. What time do we?
10 of 10.
Keep going. Okay, I'll just finish. And if you get bored, raise your hands and I'll talk faster. I talk too fast as it is, but feel free to give me your feedback. Okay, so we'll talk about the nation. So these statistics will for sure be familiar to the academics in the room and might be familiar to you back there if you followed this argument at all. As I said, in 2009 is when I started doing this research. I was running a women's site at the time. In the introduction, I recount the story of what kind of initially started me on this research, which has to do with this couple that I befriended, and I'm going to leave that to you to read. But the background story of what I was thinking about was the numbers, basically, that were coming at me. In 2009 was when women became the majority of the workforce. As I said, now it's about 50%. In the recent Labor Department numbers that came out, men are at their lowest labor force participation rate since the 1950s. And so at the time, at the height of the recession was when a lot of economists were describing this as one of our greatest social crises, the idea that men were no longer in the labor force at the rates that they had been and were heading into disability roles at much greater numbers. If you look over the long course of the century, men, as many people I'm sure will point out, male and female incomes have not converged, but male incomes have been slowly declining or rather stagnating, while women's incomes have been rising and then leveling off. And so those are the differences between men and women on a broad scale. That was also the year that the Pew study called breadwinner wives, when that term sort of entered the conversation about women who make more money than their husbands and how this was a growing phenomenon and what did it mean, and also the time when we started to talk about the boom in single motherhood and why was this happening and why were fewer people getting married. So what's behind this shift? I'll speak about it in very broad terms because we'll speak about it more specifically in the work panel. Largely it's the waning of the manufacturing economy, the beginning of the service and technology and information economy. In the list of top jobs projected to grow, women dominate 12 out of 15. Now, this is not because these are great jobs. A lot of these are health service industry jobs, and I think we're going to debate later on about whether women are ghettoizing themselves or taking advantage of opportunities in this economy. We'll talk about that later, but the fact is that the kinds of jobs that are growing in this economy are jobs that women tend to gravitate towards. One concept that occurred to me when I was writing my story was something called the traveling sisterhood, which is this idea that as women enter the economy at the top, as lawyers, accountants, pharmacists, whatever women tend to do, they open up jobs at the bottom for things that women and wives used to do for free. So child care, elder care, food preparation, all the things that we traditionally call women's work are jobs that open up as someone like me works. I hire my babysitter and I eat out and I do all sorts of things that I would have been doing for my children at home. Not that I ever see my children while I'm on book tour, but that I used to do for my children before I wrote this book. And then the important one, of course, which we'll talk about is education and the meaning of that, the fact that for every 3 degrees that women earn, men earn 2. And I think that's an increasingly important part of the story, especially in the US, because whether we like it or not, a whole lot of jobs now require college degrees or some sort of credentialing and skills that that didn't used to before. And I think that is a big part of the story, especially for young women. Why are young women more successful at getting college degrees than men, and what does that mean? So what's driving women forward? Here is the part of my talk that I talk about that people find insulting, so forgive me. There was a concept that came to me as I was trying to define the differences between men and women, and the characters that came to me was plastic woman and cardboard man. The idea being that women have been more flexible, and I'm not talking about an individual woman whose personality is more flexible. I'm mostly talking about roles that men and women play. So if you look over the course of the century, what you see is that women have vastly changed the ways that they behave in the public sphere. So it used to be that women didn't work when they got married, or they didn't work when they had children, and over time what you see is women slowly changing those roles. You see women moving into once male-dominated professions over the course of the century, but you very rarely see men moving into professions that women used to do. That's something men have always been very reluctant to do. Economists often warn me when I talk about growing jobs, it's not that interesting to look at which specific jobs are on the list because technology can make a job obsolete in a second. That the important quality to look at is kind of how able and how quickly are you able to adapt to changes in the economy. So I think that's the key element right now. I think with women, one interesting thing to note is it's essential to the story that women have been marginalized, continue to be marginalized in terms of wage differences, and are starting at the bottom because the marginalized hustle and I think the marginalized in any situation are more adaptable. So when I look at the women that I write about, they almost appear to me like immigrants. In other words, there's some sort of demonic force driving them forward where they feel like if they don't move forward, they're going to fall through the cracks. And so I think, so that's an essential part of why women move forward. Stephanie Kuntz, in her recent op-ed on this subject, came up with the term masculine mystique, which has stuck in my head because her argument was that what we did to women in 1962, which was paint a fairly narrow band in which they could exist in the public sphere, is maybe something like what we have to think about whether we're doing that to men now, whether they are existing in too narrow a band, which is not serving them well, either for domestic relationships or for the workplace. And the final thing I want to say on this subject is I do not believe that these qualities are innate. I don't know enough about this because I'm not a biologist, and so this is something I have to be educated on, but there have been other periods in history, like I think of World War II, when men had a tremendous amount of flexibility. They were coming back from war, came back and wanted to basically reassert their patriarchal privilege in society. The GI Bill was passed, lots of men went to college. I mean, there's been plenty of moments in history where different people respond in different ways. I just think now it's an accident of history and culture and kind of the opening opportunities of feminism that you have women moving forward in the way that I'm describing. Okay. Wow, I have a long way to go and I've been talking a lot. I'll compress the next parts. So what are the social consequences of the shifts that I describe? So let's start with younger women. You're starting out life, you've graduated from college. One of the things that I talk about, I think some people say most controversially in this book, is the hookup culture. I don't think I have to define it for you. As I said in my book reading last night, if you don't know what it means, you can turn to the young person sitting next to you and ask them what it means, but let's just briefly define it as the ability to have emotional intimacy without long-term commitment. We'll just leave it at that for now. This has largely been described as a disaster for women and as women being wholly the victims of this culture. And I think in this book what I tried to do is complicate that picture a little bit. Maybe we'll talk about whether I complicated it too much and was too much towards the sort of woman empowerment side, but I was leaning on the study by Elizabeth Armstrong and Linda Hamilton, who, to my great amazement, spent 4 years in camping out in a college dorm, which they described as a party dorm. And their aim initially was to look for sexual violence in college relationships. And what they found was something very interesting, which I, in my very cursory research, could pick up on, which is that even though any time you talk to women, and any book about the hookup culture will say this, you will pick up lots of individual complaints about the way men behave and their inability to commit and how unpleasant it is for women to exist in the hookup culture, that's a sort of day-to-day timeline that operates, but that there's a whole other timeline, a sort of long-term timeline that's in the back of women's minds, which has to do with their desire at that point in life to not get pinned down in long-term relationships. That's actually the sort of big picture that the women are thinking about. So contrary to this idea that, women always want commitment and men are always just trying to squirm out of commitment, that in fact it's quite dangerous for women to be pinned down. So they described in the course of their study lots of women who were actively avoiding being pinned down and actually feeling that was quite a dangerous and unsuccessful way to go about things. Now, since my excerpt in the Atlantic magazine talked about the hookup culture, my chapter in the book is quite a bit more complicated, I think because I'm genuinely ambivalent about it. So in the chapter in the book, the woman who starts out as the most trash-talking, one-night standing, vulgar, straight from the movie Bachelorette's character that I follow actually ends up getting engaged by the end of the chapter. And I think that's because, ultimately, I think we do seek human connection. And I'll talk about that a little bit at the end of the book. So I don't think you want to leave it that women are just kind of on their own and never want to get married, because that's obviously not true. By the time she gets to be in her 30s, she really does want to get married. But I want to read to you this letter. Since I wrote that chapter, I've had a lot of young women write me say, thank you for giving a different view. I think you're right that we neither want one-night stands nor do we want totally committed relationships, but I think you did not do a good job of defining what it is that we do want. And so I've had a lot of women come and write me about this third form of relationship that they do want, and I'm going to read you one of these letters I thought was quite eloquent. This new type of relationship we're after is different than what's come before. We want a person to hook up with, but also to hang out with, but none of the stifling constraints and stodgy strictures of the old-school boyfriend-girlfriend commitment. We don't want to be compelled by expectations to do each other's laundry or bring each other chicken soup when one of us is sick. We don't want to see each other every day and watch a sappy movie on a Friday night and snuggle. Now, by the way, this completely describes my life, so it's insulting, but that's okay. I'm in my 40s. It doesn't matter anymore. We want a relationship of freedom, the freedom to be there for each other and available sexually when it suits the both of us, and also emotionally when it suits the both of us. We want it to be fun and involve some dates and long talks over coffee, but we certainly don't want these, and she puts in quotes, relationships, to have an expectation of long-term commitment. Some people might call that selfish. We call it smart and independent and secure. So, I have to admit that sometimes when I read about the hookup culture, like a chill goes down my spine of the thought of my children going to college. But actually, when I read these letters, I don't feel that way. I don't feel that the situation she's describing is quite different than how I dated when I was in college, but it does not seem to me like the worst thing in the world. Okay, let's move on. You're older now. You've gotten married. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what I write about in terms of marriage. I think the rise of women is having we'll talk about this more in the family section, but a significant effect on marriage patterns and driving marriage in not just two different directions, but two quite opposite directions, depending on what social class you're in. So one of the types of marriages that I describe, I call the seesaw marriage. I don't actually know if it's statistically accurate, but it's a kind of, because the educated classes, meaning people literally with a college degree is how they divide these, are getting married, they're having the more solid marriages than they've ever had before. So it's actually interesting to note that the same people going through the hookup culture are also having marriages they rate as happy or very happy, have a pretty low rate of divorce, and relatively speaking to the previous decades, and are very unlikely to have a child and not be married. So, I don't know how those two things work. I don't know what the hookup culture, why it prepares you for a happy marriage, but it seems that it does. What I mean by the seesaw marriage is, unlike, say, in 1962, if you think about, the feminine mystique or a novel like Revolutionary Road, where men and women felt effectively trapped in certain kinds of, certain kinds of roles. So the men felt the burden of being a breadwinner, which was enforced fairly brutally in the late 50s and early 60s in literature and psychology and sociology, and the women, felt the need to be a homemaker in a fairly brutally enforced way. We have eased our restrictions somewhat on that among the progressive educated classes, and so you end up, this is only theoretical. I'm not saying this works out this way, but theoretically anybody can play any role at any given time. And so you have a marriage like the Obamas, for example. The Bidens had a marriage like this too, where initially Michelle Obama is working as a healthcare executive and making a lot of money, while Barack Obama is doing his public service or, working as going to law school. And then now you have her in the supportive role while he's the president. They're an extreme example, but just this idea that you can switch places, which I think young people actually take more for granted. I interviewed a lot of young people who actually use the word breadwinner, and it seems to me it has for them actually no gender attachment at all. So they'll say things like, whoever's playing the breadwinner role at the time, which was certainly not true for me. I still associated breadwinner with the man. Now, why do I say this is only theoretically true? Because, of course, because certain patterns do take hold, and women do end up ultimately decreasing their work to do more childcare in a lot of these marriages. So I think it's, it's only theoretical, but it does still have an important psychological effect. Now, what's the problem with the system I describe? The consolidation of privilege, basically, that rich people in the Mad Men era, rich men used to marry their secretaries, and even though we might find that sort of, annoying when we see Don Draper do it, we, on the other hand, it kind of spread the wealth. Whereas now, the wealthy marry the wealthy, and so you consolidate knowledge and wealth, and you create what one sociologist described as marriage as a class luxury. So just like everything else in America, marriage is something that's reserved for the educated and the elites. And so what happens to everybody else's marriage? When people talk about marriage declining, they're specifically talking about marriage declining for people without college degrees. There, what you see is a pretty clear pattern of fewer people getting married, of divorce rates that have stayed just about as high as they were in the 1970s. And, basically one of, I guess, the great, as June might call it, the red state, blue state ironies is that the college-educated have become the standard bearers of traditional conservative marriage, while everybody, while the sexual revolution basically destroyed everybody else's marriages. And so I think the interesting question to discuss is, why is this happening? If I were Charles Murray, I would say that this was happening is because people's morals or values have declined. That's the conservative view. And if I'm other people, I would say that it's because women, like the woman I describe, are judging men like Troy as not reasonable marriage partners. Okay, so I'm going to close off now. Where are we now? Obviously, women have a lot more roles than they used to. They are sort of lead TV anchors, Ivy League college heads. There's a lot of things women do that they haven't done before, but of course I live on this planet, and more specifically, I live in Washington, D.C., so I know that there are lots of places at the top where women are missing, and I hope that we get to talk about that at all a lot more. One of the papers that came in, which was June Carbon's and Naomi Kahn's, this phrase really stuck in my head, that you could just as easily see the situation I'm describing as the rise of the elephant seals, and what they mean by that is the idea that wealth is consolidated at the top, and that the very richest are still largely male. And so when you project into the future, I guess I would just say that I see a lot of different possibilities taking hold. It might be that you have breakthroughs by superwomen like Marissa Mayer, who work and don't take maternity leave. They're actually defined in the sociological literature. The women who take no time off are these sort of superwomen who break through. They're very unusual, but you could have a sort of an Obama situation where we suddenly have a woman we can elect as president, and that changes the way we view things. It might be that we get better at figuring out structural arrangements around childcare, but the best of all possible options for me, because when I think about what do I want after the end of men, obviously I don't want to ship all the men to the moon. I think the situations I'm describing where men are absent from the picture are actually dysfunctional situations and not really good situations. And so what I hope for is a situation where we get a little bit more flexible about gender roles. My true hope is not that we all start working a lot more so we can make a lot more money and close the wage gap that way, but my actual deep hope is that we all become like the Swedish and the Dutch, and we work a lot less, and women get to remake the economy in their own image. But I realize that's completely, totally ridiculous and idealistic. But when I think more realistically about what I would like for, say, my own two sons, because I have two sons and a daughter, is I think a world in which if my own son decides that he wants to work 4 days a week, and on the 5th day take care of his kids or do his sculpting or whatever it is he wants to do, and somebody should pass him by in a playground at 3 o'clock on a weekday afternoon, absolutely nobody who passes him by has the thought, what's wrong with that guy? Or does that guy not have a job? Or anything else like that, or interviews him for a book, or puts him on a TV show, or writes a front-page New York Times story about whither the stay-at-home dads, but that it becomes a fairly normal situation which does not cause him to feel emasculated or his wife to think any less of him. So that's my hope for the post-End of Men era, and thank you guys very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Hannah. And now we're going to go directly to Professor Ralph Richard Banks from Stanford Law School, who's making his way down the stairs as we speak. And then immediately after him, we're going to hear from Professor Michael Kimmel, a sociologist at SUNY Stony Brook. Okay.
So thank you, Linda, for organizing this. This is a wonderful event. I can attest to the fact that I admire the degree of organization that has gone into this and the assemblage of such a great cast of characters here. I'd also like to thank Hanna Rosin for writing such an important and timely book. This book is important, of course, because the family is central, not only in our society, but in any society. The book is timely because it's beyond debate that there is something changing with respect to the family, with respect to the roles of men and women, whether we think about this in terms of education, in terms of economics, in terms of gender roles. Things are different now than they've ever been in our history. And that is most apparent, I think, when I talk to journalists, frankly, and talk to people at major publications, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and websites. And I was asking one of them not long ago, I said, well, you guys seem to have been running lots of articles about gender roles and how gender roles are changing. And I was asking, well, why is that? And then my editor friend told me, he said, well, we find that when we do, we get the most hits. I mean, just literally, they get the most response that people out there in the world are feeling, kind of in our gut in a way it's hard to articulate, that something's shifting, that in some way we're at a transformational moment. We don't quite know what to make of it or how to understand it, but we know that things are not the way they have been. And that's why it's important to write about these issues now. Many of us here, I think, as we think about these changes, share a vision for how we might imagine or want things to be. I too have 3 children. We tried for that girl, never quite worked out. So we have 3 boys. And when I think about the world I would want for them, it is one in which gender roles are much more fluid, not only egalitarian, but much less rigid, much less restricting, so that people can structure their lives as they see fit. And the big question, of course, is how do we get to that world? Many of the panels that follow will no doubt interrogate, as we say in academia, or one might say take issue with many of the claims made in the End of Men. Many panelists will question whether the stories that Hanna Rosin tells actually fit the facts on the ground. These are legitimate inquiries because the individual stories are meant to illustrate broader social trends. And these are necessary inquiries because the most important thing is that we really try to get the facts right and to try to understand what's happening in our society and what it might mean for our children. So I'll leave for later the discussion of some of the broader issues raised by the book. And for now, I'd just like to highlight one case of what I think is a slippage between the stories the book tells and the actual world in which we live. The big story that Hanna Rosin tells is undoubtedly correct. Women are gaining ground, men are losing ground. Wives are earning more, husbands are earning less. This is most true with African Americans, which I'll talk about later. But when you move closer to this changing economic landscape, things look a bit different. The book focuses a lot, for example, on women with high-powered jobs, the graduates of elite law schools, the graduates of schools like this, schools like Stanford or Harvard or Columbia, the people who work at Facebook and Google, who are married. These are the women who we imagine eclipsing men economically, moving to the forefront of American commerce. And so you might think that these are the women who are in the seesaw marriages that Hanna Rosin refers to, that these are the women who are out-earning their husbands. And we all know many such women who are out-earning their husbands, likely, or at least some such women who are out-earning their husbands. But in fact, when you look at the broad picture, when you look at the data, what you find is that, ironically, the women who are best positioned to transform education into income often don't. The women who are best positioned to transform their education into income often don't. The seesaw marriages are not typically marriages between a corporate lawyer, a wife, and a husband who earns less. They're not the marriages between the two corporate types who start out and then the woman's earning $8,000 more than the husband some years later. Those may be true stories individually, but they're actually not true socially. The most common seesaw marriage, frankly, is more likely to be a situation where the woman's an administrative assistant and the husband's a construction worker. And he was earning more than her when he was working, but when he's not, he's not. What do we see when we look at very well-educated women, the graduate of elite universities and elite professional schools, is in fact the persistence of what we might describe as traditional gender roles. If you look at the graduates of Stanford Law School, for example, or Stanford Business School, 10 years later, almost all of the husbands are in the workforce full-time, except those who've retired, and there are many of them. But most of the wives are not. And this is true at schools across the nation. Right? When you look at year 1, year 2, year 3, men and women are marching through the corporate world together. But when you look at year 10 or year 12 or year 15, we find that many of the women have left the work world full-time, but most of the men have not. And the question is, why is this? Well, there are many reasons. The one that we hear about a lot is that there's a difficulty in combining work and family. Jobs are rigid. It's difficult to be a lawyer and to take care of children. It's difficult to have any job, actually, and take care of children. As I often ask myself when I'm dealing with the child's demand, they want to eat again? Didn't I just have a parent-teacher conference? And these are issues that arise frequently. But the question, though, is why is it that women end up being the one to leave the workforce rather than men? Right? Because you could imagine that if there's a conflict between work and family, that half the time the men would leave, half the time the women would leave. And part of the story there, of course, is that women feel an increased responsibility to take care of children. So we could frame this story as a story about the bind in which we place women. We expect women to take care of children, even as now women have begun to work. But we can also see this story or this pattern as about restrictions that we place on men. We could see an explanation for the persistence of gender patterns, not in terms of the bind we put women in, but in terms of the persistent expectation that men be the one to support the family. We could frame this narrative more generally not as women trying to get what men have, but as men needing to get what women have, which is options. Most women, even if they feel the bind, the pressures between work and family, do experience themselves as having a choice about whether to work. And they make a choice. Men, on the other hand, often don't feel that they have such a choice. Because even as women are encouraged to work and men are encouraged to help care for children, there remains an expectation that the man's job is to support the family. And this is one of the themes that's sort of latent in the book, but not fully developed. I encountered this view frequently in interviews that I did for my own book some years ago. And it came in the form of lots of women who earned a lot of money feeling, in short, that their money was their money. So women would tell stories, and these are lawyers, architects, engineers, business people. These women would tell stories about their mothers having told them, your job is to go out and earn money so that you will never be dependent on a man. And this is especially true among African Americans, but I think it's true more generally. Women are taught to earn money to avoid being dependent on a man, to have what women variously refer to as pen money, mad money, but something of one's own that would allow for a woman to support herself. Men, on the other hand, work not out of personal choice, but to fulfill a familial obligation. These different roles are reflected as well in data about financial decision making, and there's a lot of it out there. That suggests we regard men and women's financial roles differently. Probably my favorite piece is one, I think this might be from the Pew study, where they did a study about the financial decision-making within a couple. And the question is, who has the final say when it comes to money matters? And in many couples, they both have final say. They both have they make decisions jointly. But when you looked at couples where the husband was the top earner, as opposed to couples where the wife was the top earner, you saw quite a stark difference. In couples where the husband was the primary earner, the spouses were about equally likely to each have final say. So sometimes it's joint, and then other times it's the husband, other times it's the wife. But when you looked at couples where the wife was the top earner, where she actually earned the bulk of the income, wives were twice as likely as their husbands to have final say over the money. This is as clear an expression as I could imagine of the idea that the husband earns the money for the family, but the wife earns the money, or when the wife earns the money is her money. In a way, it is not for the husband when he earns the money. And this is important to understand this dynamic, because when we understand that the persistence of gender roles is usually talked about in terms of women's options and what women are now permitted to do and the range of choices that women have. And it's important that women have a wide range of choices. But it's also important to recognize that in a peculiar way, women's choices actually depend on men's not having a choice. If a woman feels as though I have a choice about whether to work, that's what feminism has brought me, that's what progress has brought me, I have a choice about whether to work, the implication of that is that, in fact, the man doesn't have a choice. Her having a choice depends on his not having a choice, because someone has to have the obligation to support the family. You can't both decide in most cases not to work. If we want to move toward this gender egalitarian society that we envision, where the roles are fluid, where it makes little difference whether the man works or whether the woman works, who takes care of the children, we need to recognize that the restrictions that we need to topple are not only restrictions that limit women, they're restrictions that limit men. And we need to also recognize, and this is the most challenging part, our own investment in all of those expectations. So, Hannah, at the very end, you mentioned the world you would want for your son, and you want to have you would like to see a world where his girlfriend can earn more money than him, and no one remarks on that, right, or thinks that's remarkable. And that's a good place for us to be. We'd also need to have a world, say, where a man could say, well, after college, I expect to work for a few years, and then when my wife graduates law school and starts pulling down the big bucks, I'm going to stay home with the children. And no parent thinks that that's undesirable, right? That's actually the world we need to have. And we're a long way from that world. But as women continue to advance and as younger generations replace older ones, hopefully we'll move closer to that so that my children will be able to structure their life however they see fit. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to this, and I want to pose a question. Here's the question. Is it the case that it is the end of men, or is it the case that men are still in power? The answer, yes. You'd have to be napping, as those legions of stay-at-home dads often do, to have missed the hoopla over Hanna Rosin's cover story in The Atlantic and the big news about her book and the various serial rights she's sold. First thing I want to say is, well done, we're all jealous. But the book has been amazingly misread, I think. Rosin's been called a radical feminist for celebrating men's demise, and an anti-feminist for suggesting that women have already won and that discrimination is a thing of the past. I think some of this misreading is deliberate. People read with agendas, after all. And I think that some part of it has to do with the way the book is framed by Rosin and also her marketers. After all, if you look at the book's cover itself, the central thesis blares at you in a big, bold headline, "The End of Men," and underneath, in small print, that is the subtitle, "And the Rise of Women." I believe the subtitle of her work is entirely right, but that the title has some problems. Let me explain. I think that The Rise of Women is clear that there's been a dramatic change in women's lives over the past half-century. The question in this book has been, what has been the impact of those enormous changes in women's lives over the past half-century to men? And for that, I want to tease out a couple of assumptions in the argument and then point to a few of the areas that she touched on in her talk in understanding the state of American masculinity. One assumption is causal. The relationship of title to subtitle makes it appear that men ended and then women have arisen to take their place. Surely this is backward history. If men are ending, it's attendant upon and a consequence of the rise of women. They are women, we hear them roar, and we shrivel right up. The second assumption is logical. Rosin's title and subtitle, indeed the entire book until the conclusion, assume that gender is a zero-sum game, that one rises and one falls, and neither can they rise together, nor can they fall together. Even if she doesn't share the interplanetary theory of gender, that men are from Mars and women are from Venus, she does believe that there is a battle of the sexes, a war between the sexes, and that at present, as one of her male informants puts it, our team is losing. Indeed, we were just on TV early this morning here in Boston, and the way they framed our TV appearance, although we said nothing of the kind, was here's a new take in a new skirmish, I suppose, in the battle of the sexes. This is what I call the either-or assumption. Either women are winning or losing, or that men are winning or losing. Either things are getting better or they're getting worse. Either we're all bowling alone, or we're connecting with everyone we've ever met in a virtual friending frenzy. Either hooking up is his wet dream and her nightmare, or her sexual empowerment at his expense. We sociologists see things differently. We see things as both and. Both statements are true. It's understanding the relationship between the two sides that is our analytic meat, or in this context, perhaps our analytic tofu. The third assumption is sociological. Rosin treats men, or as she calls her two-dimensional cartoon version in her talk, cardboard man, as some antediluvian dinosaur, unwilling or unable to adapt, slouching toward extinction. But this raises a question. Which men is she talking about? When she writes that, quote, men's hold on the pinnacles of power is loosening, Is she speaking of gay men, black men, Latino men, working class men, upper class men, Asian men, trans men, older men, boys? No. Actually, even if it was the end of men, it's the end of middle-class straight white men. And it's not really the end of them, of course. It's the end of their unquestioned entitlement. Second, if men are ending, what's driving them toward that cliff of oblivion? Is it the rise of women? I don't think so. I think it's the archaic definitions of masculinity that are, and this is the key for me, enforced and policed pretty relentlessly by other men. Rosin omits the central dynamic of masculinity, that is, its homosociality. Because our time is short, and I know that others are going to cover specific areas, I just want to touch briefly on three of them that will illustrate my argument with the book as a whole. Let's start with the economy. Here, I think that we clearly have the data that women's lives have changed. But I think what we get is the either-or half. For example, we hear that women are the majority of the workforce. Most managers and professionals are now women. 1 out of 5 men are out of work. That women dominate in 13 of the 15 job categories, expected to grow most in the next decade. Now, all of these statements are controversial. All of them have been amply refuted by economists. But I want to take one example of this. The statement about managers and professionals takes a massively broad job category but doesn't disaggregate it. There's significant gender segregation among professionals, so that men outnumber women in some areas like engineering, architecture, computer science, but women outnumber men in education, training, library occupations. And in that same aggregate, women earn 73.5% of the salary of men. At the same time, the European Union's Justice Commission just recently wrote that corporate self-regulation has failed to crack the glass ceiling, and the Justice Commissioner advocated a quota system modeled after Norway's. How can it be that women keep banging their heads on the glass ceiling if they've already crashed through it? The truth is that both sides are right. Women's gains have been in some sectors and not others, and in middle management, not at the top. Women are rising, men are not falling. Take a more recent example, the man session, which we heard about in Hanna's talk. Here again, I think she's half right. The man session of 2007 to 9 hit men very hard. 70% of jobs lost were jobs that had been held by men. But the he session has also been replaced by a he-covery. Since January 2010, job growth for men has been significantly greater than job growth for women. According to Heather Boucher, between July 2009 and December 2010, women lost 222,000 jobs and men gained 640,000. But the explanation here is less about gender, although one must always ask, what gender did we think was going to be holding the shovel of all those shovel-ready jobs that were part of the stimulus package? The question is also where the jobs are and are not. Job losses have been most severe in the public sector, teachers, administrators, secretaries, jobs held by women. In effect, the American response to the man session was a massive transfer of wealth and jobs to the private sector and away from the state and local government. In a sense, we gave to him at her expense. What we've actually seen, I believe, is a dramatic masculinization of public spending. Second, education. Hanna spends a significant amount of time talking about the boy crisis in school. This relies on 3 empirical findings: that boys are lagging behind girls in college attendance and higher education. Girls constitute 60% of all entering freshmen in college campuses this year. Girls' achievement outpaces boys, the well-known statistic that 70% of all high school valedictorians last year were girls. And that boys are dramatically overrepresented on the behavioral and discipline side of things, getting suspended, committing suicide, getting into fights, being diagnosed with ADHD and the like. But again, this may be only a partial framing. What we see then is not, for example, that on-campus men are declining while women are rising, but rather that both women and men's college attendance has been increasing, although the rate of increase is far faster for women than it is for men. More people are going to college than ever before. Is it a zero-sum game? It is only if you think that men's decline is because of women's gain. Only if you think that increased attention to individual learning styles, greater teacher training, more flexible classroom organization, and a different variety of text is a bad thing for boys. But then you'd have to have a pretty inflexible view and unforgiving view of boys to think that. Finally, let's talk about sex. This is something I happen to know a lot about. Seriously, Not only have I been teaching courses on sexuality at large public universities for the past 25 years, but I'm also one of the investigators on the study that Hanna cites, the Online Campus Social Life Survey, originally developed by Paula England, then at Stanford, now at NYU. We have data from about 20,000 undergraduates from colleges and universities all over the country, and we followed it up with a lot of interviews. The good news is that Hanna does not wring her hands and deliver yet another anti-feminist Jeremiah that hooking up is terrible for girls who really just want relationships anyway and who put up with hooking up because, well, they have to. It's the only way to meet a guy. She does see hooking up as a possible expression of women's empowerment. I think the data are more muddy. Yes, it's true that women have far greater sexual autonomy than they ever have, despite current efforts to roll these back to the pre-pill era, except the aspirin pill era. They have far more control over their sexuality until they face an unwanted pregnancy. They are far more able to make sexual choices until they're drunk at a frat party, at which time their choices may have been made for them by someone else. The problem is not that women are exercising more sexual control and able to engage in casual sex. It's the context of that increased sexual agency. And the context there, as I try to talk about in my book Guyland, is still that when it comes to sex on campus, men still rule. Women's participation in hookup culture is not driven simply by women's sexual agency, but also by women's compliance. Here's an example. Check this out on your own campus. At campuses with nationally recognized Greek letter fraternities and sororities, only the fraternities are permitted to have alcohol at parties. Sororities are prohibited by charter. So who has the parties? And which gender controls the flow of the evening? Who gets into the party and who doesn't? The choice for women is quite often babe or bitch, compliant or resistant. In the online survey, we kept asking questions. We found out a lot of things about hooking up, and everything that Hanna says about it, is pretty true, all about how deliberately vague it is, so she can, they can both do what they want. He's a stud, she's not a slut. And how it's always accompanied, it seems, by copious amounts of alcohol. So we started asking questions like, okay, if you're always so sloppy drunk that you can barely stand up, how good's the sex? And we found, so we looked for some proxy measures of how good is the sex. And so we asked questions about orgasm. We thought that might be a reasonable proxy measure. So we asked, and of course we found a significant orgasm gap, to be expected. We also asked, so we asked if you had an orgasm at last hookup, but we also found a perception of orgasm gap. We asked, did your partner have an orgasm at last hookup? The women's perceptions were exactly the same percentage as the men. 44% of the men said they had an orgasm at last hookup, and 44% of the women said, yes, my partner had an orgasm at last hookup. What a surprise. But the men dramatically overestimated their female partner's orgasm by a factor of more than 2. The men did even worse on oral sex. Only 1 in 4 women experienced orgasm from cunnilingus, and 60% of the men were quite certain that their partners had had an orgasm. So, what did we find that was going on? Well, we started probing this in interviews, and here's what we found. Some of the women were faking it. One said, to make that person feel good, to make them feel like they'd done their job. Another said, really just to end it because I was bored with it. Now listen to this one extract, which I quote in Guyland, and I actually think maybe the most revealing quote of all around women's sexuality on college campuses, because what you'll hear is in between 2 sentences, she shifts from the fully agentic, empowered woman that Hanna describes to a traditional feminine affective style. Here's what she says. He was trying so hard to make me come, and there was no way it was going to happen. I felt so bad for him. I'd gone down on him, and he came already, and he was trying to be such a good sport about it. But really, so I just faked it, and he felt good, and I felt relieved. So do you hear in between? First she says there was no way it was going to happen. This fully sexually empowered, sexually agentic, hookup woman, does she say, get back to work? Does she say, or I'll take care of it myself? No. She says, I felt so bad for him. So in that space, in between those 2 sentences, she moves from a fully agentic, empowered position to one of a traditional feminine position. And if there's more, after you've hooked up for a couple of times, you always have to have the conversation, which at Stanford is called the DTR, define the relationship. On most college campuses, they call it the talk. okay, we've hooked up a couple of times, et cetera, so are we a couple or not? And what we found was that in over 95% of the cases, it is women who initiate the DTR, women who initiate the talk. That is not about gender equality, that is about gender inequality. That women still see hooking up, as pleasurable and as agentic as they may find it, they still see it as a path to relationships. Okay, however hyperbolic, I think there is a conversation here that focuses on all the right issues, and I want to compliment Hanna for doing that. Interestingly, the book's conclusion, Rosin changes course. It isn't the end of men after all. Even Calvin, her working-class muse, is turning things around. Men, she writes, will, quote, learn to expand the range of options for what it means to be a man, unquote. Cardboard man is becoming more plastic. And, she adds, I want to teach them to bend. She can help, but I have to say, the brothers are doing it for themselves. No, it's not the emergence of domesticated daddies or some corporate castrati. No, it's that regardless of race or class, American men are quietly accommodating themselves to a greater gender equality than our country has ever seen. Whether it's in cross-sex friendships, sharing more housework and childcare, corporate partnerships, or voting for a woman for the White House, the sexes have never been more equal, ever. The statement that she quotes by Bradford Wilcox may be, to my mind, the most wrong-headed statement of all, when he says that the changes in marriages have certainly been bad for men and bad for children. The data point decidedly in the other direction, that gender equality is a win-win, not a zero-sum, and that what is proven to enable women to live the lives they say they want to live is also possible for the first time for men to live the lives that we say we want to live. The data here are quite clear. The more egalitarian men are in their relationships, the better their children do at school. They have higher grades, lower rates of absenteeism, just 2 paragraphs more. Kids are happier, they're healthier, they do better in school. And their wives are happier, yeah, and healthier, and the men are happier. They report higher levels of marital satisfaction, lower rates of drinking, smoking, taking recreational drugs. They're more likely to have routine screenings and less likely to go to the ER. They're less likely to see a therapist, less likely to be diagnosed with depression. And they have more sex. This, then, is a book not about the end of patriarchy, not about the end of men. The end of that unquestioned entitlement that straight white men have felt access to positions of power, to corner offices, to women's bodies, that casual assumption that all positions of power, wealth, influence, and, let's face it, fun, are reserved for us, and that women's presence is to be resisted if possible, tolerated if not. The end of male entitlement, economic, political, familial, and sexual, does accompany the rise of women, and that end cannot come soon enough, for it also offers a possibility for men to become as three-dimensional as women have become. In 1916, on the eve of one of the great suffrage demonstrations in New York, writer Floyd Dell sat in his Greenwich Village apartment thinking about how to engage men in supporting gender equality. He was one of the founders of the Men's League for Women's Suffrage, and in an article he wrote in 1916, he wrote an article entitled "Feminism for Men." And he came up with a line that I think captures the essence of my argument to you this morning. Feminism will, he wrote, for the first time, allow men to be free. The rise of women is not at all the end of men. It's actually the beginning. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I would just ask our keynote speaker and our 2 commentators if they would mind coming to the table, and then we have some time for, I don't know, Hanna, do you want to take a few minutes and respond, or do you want to hear questions, or both, or what's your... I would like to give you a few minutes if you want, and then I definitely want to give people a chance to ask any of you questions.
Oh, well, let them start. Let me think.
Okay, so why don't we come up here at the table here? There's mics that should be working. And got lights in my eyes,
Okay.
but just invite people to ask questions. And we have mics, so if you ask a question, because this is being videotaped, please speak into a mic. So it's hard for me to see, but any questions, comments, hands?
Somebody ask a question, because I need 5 minutes.
Anybody? Anybody?
Come on,
Ferris?
come on,
Anybody?
Come on, it's a university. Impress me here. Somebody?
Anybody?
Hi. Is this on? Hi, I actually have a question for Richard, or for Ralph Richard Banks.
You can call me Rick.
Rick. The study about the top earners and families, if the male is a top earner versus the woman, and how people view their roles in making those decisions, what were the questions that were being asked? Because I wonder about, if you're being asked as a couple sitting both at the kitchen table and you're looking at each other as you're giving your answer, or if you're being asked in a way where the question possibly could presume the answer. Because I found that surprising that in a situation where the woman is the top earner, that necessarily the woman views the money as her own based on that answer she gave. So I'm just wondering about the survey itself.
Yeah, so I had trouble hearing you a bit. I think we have an echo of sorts in here, but so I think this study comes, and someone in here can probably pull it up. This may have been the Pew Research Women, Men, New Economics of Marriage study, where they had that survey, and and the finding again was that when men are the top, so the question is how do couples make decisions about money? Sometimes they make all big decisions jointly, and sometimes for big decisions, one partner or the other partner makes the decision, has the final say. And so when they look at families, again, where the husband is the top earner, the husband is as likely as the wife to have the final say on big financial decisions. But when you look at families where the wife is the top earner, the wife is about twice as likely as the husband to have final say. And I looked at that for a long time before I realized what that meant. And it was only after I connected it actually to interviews and people saying that even though, well, actually there was one woman in particular who I interviewed for my book, who's a corporate lawyer, earned a lot more money than her husband, and she talked about giving her husband money for things that the husband wanted to do. And he would actually have to come to her and ask for money. And he said, well, why don't we just have a joint account and put it all in one big account? And she didn't want to do that because after all, this was her money that she had earned. And she insisted that she was, very reasonable, and her questions were very reasonable, and she just wanted to be sure he was going to use the money responsibly and that it wasn't going to be wasted, but it was her money. And then that's when it hit me that this sort of finding in the Pew study illustrates this broader issue, which really is about the restrictions that we place on men and the freedom in an odd way that women have as a result of all these changes over the past half century. So that a woman like this corporate lawyer, she's free to work or not, and if she works, it's her money. But the expectation still is that the husband's job is to support the family. So he's earning money to satisfy a family obligation. She's earning money for self-fulfillment, for independence, for all of that, right? And if that's what's going on, it actually makes perfect sense. And I began to talk to a lot of friends, and they said, well, yeah, that actually is there's kind of a difference there.
Can I just follow up really fast? I'm wondering, though, couldn't you just make the argument that the women who are making more money have a personality type, like a corporate lawyer who might be a bit more controlling? And I will say I'm a person like that. So, where I'd be like, where's my money going, or where's our money going? Because I care about where our finances are ending up. And that, has the study sort of been looked at in a way where you could just dissect it based on the jobs these women have versus the jobs the men have?
I don't have any study that's done that, but so you could make the argument that, women feel entitled to control their money in a way that we don't think men should feel entitled to control their money. So if a man were to require his wife to come to him and ask for money, we would all, I think, regard that as domineering and patriarchal and the situation of inequality. But many people don't find it so objectionable for the man to be required to go to the woman and ask her for money in the situation where she earns the most. So yes, there are different norms out here. And this relates to Michael Kimmel's point, which is a great point. It really is just that we're all in this together, and there is this way where men need to be, we're not only trying to expand options for women, we also need to be aware of the way in which women's choices can sometimes, ironically, depend on men's not having choices. And that's the the tension that we need to be aware of.
There's some countervailing evidence to your point, and maybe a different interpretation of those data, is that women, we know that women, when they're given control of resources, actually deploy those resources more
You know
altruistically.
what? There's a weird echo on this mic that makes it
having
really
trouble
hard for us to understand what they're saying.
if
Is
you
it,
can't- if you can
try
have
to
the
not
voice-
use the mic and
Right.
see if we can,
Okay.
if everyone can hear you.
So I can talk very loudly.
Yes,
no
you
problem.
can. That's good.
Some countervailing evidence to your point is that when women are given control over resources, they tend to deploy them more altruistically toward their children and toward the needs of the family than men do. So just because women have control over the money, over the purse, so to speak, it doesn't mean that women are spending their money at Tiffany's. Another piece
I've
of
heard that, by the way, a lot on when people. No, I've heard that when people talk about the difference between men and women in retirement. That's a subject that comes up a lot. That the reason that women end up less, not only do they live longer, but they spread their money among family, both parents and children, so they end up with a lot less money in retirement.
I'll stop there.
Yeah, I'm not. Hey, I'd be. I'm just describing the social world we live in, right? So, it might be a good thing for women to make more financial decisions than in most couples, right? So you could, even if you're assuming that women would make better choices, it is telling that the extent to which women make those choices depends on whether they earn the money or whether the man earns the money, right? So it's kind of a story where, his money is hers and her money is hers. That's the world in which we live right now, right? His money is hers and her money is hers, and this is in tension with the idea. If we want to have gender roles that are more fluid, more egalitarian, we need to recognize the way in which we all are invested. That's my point. We need to recognize the way that we are all invested indirectly in maintaining the very systems that we might say we want to move beyond, right? And that would mean, if we move beyond that system, that would mean that, frankly, some women would have cruddy jobs that they don't like and they wish they could stay home, but they keep working because it's their job to support the family, and maybe their spouse is not working, but that's no more a negative than if he were a woman who weren't working. Right? And right now, we don't think that, right? Chris Rock tells this joke where he says, when was the last time you went to a homeless shelter and you saw a family there and you looked and said, he should leave her?
Right.
Get that? Because, everybody get that? He should leave her, right? You never think that, right? And you never think, and I admit this myself, so I have a niece. This is not going to be broadcast on television, I'm hoping, but it'll be kept close. So I have a niece.
Speaking in front of a journalist.
I have a niece. I have a niece who's in the category that Hannah would describe, who works at Google, in fact, and is fast rising, and she makes a lot more money probably than her boyfriend, who's been unemployed for periods of time. And am I a little more concerned about her future husband being unemployed than I would be if the roles were reversed and, I had a nephew who had a girlfriend who had been unemployed and took time off and all this sort of stuff? Yeah, I probably am, right? Which is just to say that I'm sort of invested in this too, right? I'm going to inquire of this young man, well, what are your plans, and so forth and so on. And if he were to say, well, once I marry your niece, I'm just going to kick back and exercise a lot and go to Pilates and take care of the home and cook, we actually probably wouldn't be real happy with that. But that's a bad thing, right? That's something that we need to move beyond so that response is no more objectionable than if a woman were to give that response. And many women, frankly, do, which is one of the things women are delaying marriage. But most of the women, even at a place like Stanford, if you say, what do you expect to do 10 years later? The percentage of them who expect to be working full time, really full tilt, is very small. Mm-hmm. Actually, most of them expect, I'm going to work for a while, I'm going to do this, and then they're going to leave that and either not work or work, but do something they really love because they know they don't have to make the money because the husband's making the money, and they have all this freedom, and they want to experience that. And that's a great thing, but we need to enable men to have that as well.
Okay, so I saw Joan
Frank also.
Can you guys hear me?
Frank
Yeah.
also wanted us.
Can you hear me? I wanted to pick up on what Rick said, but then actually lob it to Michael and Hannah for a comment. I think he said something that's really, really important for American feminism, because we say that feminism is about choices, but what we mean is that women should be able to have the choice to stay home or the choice to work. And what Rick has pointed out, which I think is so profoundly important, is that assumes that it's men's responsibility to support any woman who makes the choice not to work. And until we keep men in that straitjacket, in my opinion, women ain't going to have choices. But I would love to hear what Michael and Hannah think about that idea.
I never thought of it that way. I think it's a fabulous formulation. I mean, I've thought very generically about the idea that men don't have a lot of options, or that we internally judge, or the workplace judges men who ask for paternity leave or in all sorts of ways to do things that women do routinely. But I never thought of it in terms of choices, that by, like in the broader historical term, that by asking for choices for ourselves, we basically restricted men from having choices. I wanted to address something else, but why don't, if you have anything to say about that, you talk about that, and then I'll. Let
me just interject while you're saying, because I think too on the cardboard man issue, I think men are, and I think Michael would agree with this, men are more than ready, right, to embrace these high-earning wives who then give men the freedom to do all these things that they might want to do. I really don't think that's the problem we have. Men individually are, a lot of people in the world have jobs that they actually don't like that much, and they work the job because they need the money. And if you look at the wives of high-earning men, what they do is they leave jobs they don't like, and they do things they do like, which might earn a lot less, and it might not be full-time, but it's a lot more fulfilling. And I think there are a lot of men out there who'd be happy to have wives who make a lot of money, and they would get over feeling threatened very quickly once they realize that they can lead this fulfilling life without doing work that is emotionally deadening.
So here's the most interesting question someone asked me in an interview, which is, okay, you think it's other men socializing men. I mean, that's one thing that you write about. One question that someone asked me is it the women who do this to the men? In other words, someone asked me point blank the question, my husband, who's an editor, who runs a magazine, what if he told you tomorrow morning he's going to be a stay-at-home dad? The question is not just like, would you be okay with that? Could your finances handle that? Then the question is, would you still be attracted to him? Like, would you find him less of a man? Honestly, answer that question. I don't have an honest answer to that question, but I think that I have thought a lot about whether women, like there's something fundamental when often women who, even for the men who are not earning money, they talk about their need for the men to be like physical protectors or some kind of presence in the household, that's not so easy for women to swallow. It's not something we let our men do. So,
I just want to jump in and address Joan's question, which I think is an important question, and I think in some ways it reveals the limits of voluntarism. It reveals the limits of trying to do this as a negotiation between couples, absent any state policies that support and encourage this kind of movement. For example, we are, at least I know Hanna thinks this. I certainly do. That if you look to the Nordic countries as a model for how to engage state policies to support people making these kinds of choices, absent that, we're going to be bumping into these kinds of problems all the time. And it seems to me that we ask people to negotiate these things. We in fact insist that they do, but we give them virtually no resources with which to do it. And the voluntaristic, so that's the limits of voluntarism, is exactly the dilemma that you pose, I think.
Yeah. That's a great
structuralist.
point. Yeah.
I'll literally take 2 minutes to respond, but go ahead, ask a question, and then I'll take my 2 minutes.
Okay, so. Okay, all right, so just very quickly, you want me to use this? All right, so very quickly, I think Michael, great. All of the sort of masculinity theorists up here were nodding our heads throughout your whole talk. Hanna and Rick, I loved your talks as well, But with each of you, I was thinking, isn't choice a little more complicated than you're making it? So I'm picking on one phrase from Hanna's talk, but I think it might be somewhat representative, which is to say that those who are marginalized hustle, but knowing several people in my family who hustle because they're marginalized, they have to. Right? So it's sometimes that it's a benefit and sometimes it's not, but it's not usually a choice in the straightforward sense. And then Rick, I would just say Bell Hooks has written about the fact that plenty of black men have been quite, as you suggest, willing to let black women earn more money than them because only the black women were allowed to earn money as long as they could control that money. And control can come in forms other than the literal, like, I get to go pull the money out of the bank account. It can be other things that we know women have used as well.
So when I was here interviewing David Autor, who's an MIT economist, he actually called it the last one holding the bag theory when he described why women earn more money in certain families, that it has nothing to do with their choice and they never wanted it to be. It doesn't mean that it doesn't have any kind of empowering quality. I think it might, but that it's not in fact a choice. It's because they're stuck with the kids. And then I think then people have written about the fact that going to community college or earning money like for the kids, like women might talk about it in a positive way, but it's not that it starts out as a choice or is necessarily a choice. So I think that's okay. I'm all right with that.
Do your little response.
Do my little response. So I think that because we're an academic setting, it seems to me that we're going to all agree on gender roles and the need to be flexible about gender roles. That's not true every place I go. Some people totally object to that. But I think here it sounds like that's going to be a point of agreement. I think that the fierce or interesting or data debate is going to happen around something that you said, Rick, which is the persistence of traditional gender roles among well-educated women, and whether the choices that women making are forced or reinforcing original gender stereotypes, and particularly at the top, whether women can break through that glass ceiling, and whether I think it's very clear that the studies I like the best, because I think the wage gap is incredibly complicated to piece through where people which percentage of that is because of discrimination and other things, but those studies where they follow MBA graduates in the University of Michigan, and it's like the 7-Up studies, where those to me are the most convincing in showing what happens between men and women, because what you see is that there is very little wage gap sort of initially. There's some, it's not very much, and then sort of it grows a little more sort of based on women's choices, and then it's about 5 years after women have their first child, whether they have a second child or not, whether they have 3 children or 1, that the gap really starts to open. And so the difference between men and women and the wage gap, it's like not rocket science, right? It's obviously related to the things that we all know and live and discuss every single day, which is that women still, even though men have increased their childcare, women have increased it more. Now, my own personal ambivalence in talking about the wage gap is that I am reluctant to push. There is actually in those MBA studies a category of Marissa Mayers. In other words, the women who pay no penalty in their salary are the women who don't take any time off for family and have children. They seem to do even better than the women who don't have children, and that may be because of a personality type, but that is a minor sort of subcategory that emerges in that. And I personally find that subcategory slightly frightening. Like, I don't actually think that that's the model. So when I personally am pushing women to sort of work more and being more flexible, even though that's the sort of natural conclusion of my book, Close the Wage Gap, Work Hard, sort of switch around childcare so that it's even, it's not actually where my heart is. My heart is much more in the Sweden model, which is use social policy to effectively force men to take paternity leave so that we close the wage gap by having men earn less and not by having women earn more, because I do think that that we work in inhumane ways. And I have to say my chapter on Korea convinced me of that even more, because they have made absolutely no concessions at all to the fact that women are in the workplace. It's a super patriarchal structured workplace, and it's like horrifying. I mean, nobody ever sees their children. People work 15 hours a day. That's how women are making it in that economy, and it doesn't seem like the right way to go. So anyway, that's as we discuss women at the top and whether privilege and power is being consolidated, I don't want to automatically assume that women should then act in the way that the privileged have acted. Maybe there's some more creative way to think about how we want to structure our economy so everybody works down and not up. Anyway.
We're really over time. Hannah, do you want just very brief time, the same thing, or should
Me, I just did, that's it.
That's it? Good.
That's all I got.
Just said it. What do you mean?
I'm done.